Welcome to Halteres Presents, a brand-agnostic interview podcast that seeks to objectively highlight the happenings within the world of diagnostics. And now, your hosts, Rich Thayer and Mickey Yode.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of Halteres Presents. My name is Rich Thayer, Managing Partner of Halteres Associates.
And this is Mickey Yode, the founding partner of Halteres Associates.
Today, we welcome Holden Thorp, Editor-in-Chief of Science Magazine and family of journals. We are discussing with Holden our shared interest in the importance of scientific communications.
I've known Holden for more than 20 years, and we actually did some work together years ago in diagnostics. Holden's done quite a bit to improve the communication of science, as we discussed with him in our interview.
And now, our interview with Holden Thorp.
Welcome to the podcast, Holden. It's great to see you again after all these years.
Yeah, great to see you, Mickey. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much. Could you please just give our audience a little bit of your background?
Yes, I'm Holden Thorp. I am the editor-in-chief of Science and the Science family of journals. Before that, I was a university administrator. I was a provost at Washington University in St. Louis, the chancellor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And before that, I was a faculty member who worked on metal nucleic acid interactions and inhibitors for metalloproteins.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with you about that work way back then. That was very interesting.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Time goes by.
So in your multiple roles as editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals, one of them is what you might call ambassador of science. How do you view that role? And who's your audience? And what are your main objectives? And how's it going?
Yeah, so I don't really view myself as an ambassador to science for the public. I think there are other people that do that. I view my audience as primarily being scientists, people who read science, which is, we think around 5 million people or something like that, depending on what month you sample the data. And everything that we write is produced so that other scientists will want to read it. We don't view doing things that the general public will be able to read as within our own remit. The way we get there is that we have the largest team in all of scientific publishing that helps reporters cover our research articles. And when we do that, then we get to lots and lots of people, millions of people, through writing, we hope, of reporters who are good at translating things for the public. And the team that we use to do that is also good at that. So we don't really view ourselves as, and I get this all the time, why don't you start a weekly reader for science, or why don't you make videos on about that explain science to everybody? We do a little bit of that, but we don't view that as our primary mission. We view our primary mission, our primary audience, as scientists. So when I'm writing editorials, I'm writing to the scientific community. Sometimes they get read beyond that occasionally, but for the most part, they're really meant to be read by other scientists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can remember way back when I first started reading science, when I was in school. And at the time, you could read 50% of the articles and understand them pretty well, but it's so diverse now. The population is so diverse. It must be very difficult to communicate, even to the scientists, in a way that they'll all understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. It's much more specialized now, and you have papers that have many, many authors. And a lot of that's good because we're publishing on things that people couldn't have imagined when you and I first started reading the journal. But in theory, our goal is that if it's a paper in science, it should be understandable by any other scientist who's reasonably well trained. And some of them, no matter what we do, are always, if they're going to be technically correct, going to be possibly too specialized for that. So fortunately for me, I work with a team of 30 editors who are all experts in their individual area. And so they're able to apply their own expertise to making sure that those papers are sound, that everything that needs to be in there is in there.
They do a remarkable job.
They're amazingly smart people and really fun to work with. It's unbelievable the amount of stuff they know. We certainly are very supportive of any organization that wants to try to communicate to a broader audience. We just think it's a little hard for us to do what we want to do for scientists and do that at the same time. It takes more resources than we have, and we're not really trained to do it. We're PhDs who are trained to produce material for other scientists, and even our news reporters are so deeply embedded in science that they're science journalists who write for other scientists. But I think that the challenge of how we get things to the public in ways that they can understand is incredibly important. And in addition to what we do for reporters who cover our work, I think that partnering with people like you who have devoted themselves to this is really important. And one of the things that I write about a lot for the scientific community is that the researchers need to realize that this idea of science communication is a very worthwhile task. And one of the things that I really don't like is when I see high-powered researchers who treat the people who do science communication as not being as important as the people who do the work in the lab. Because if you ask yourself, what's happened the last 4 years, but really before that, well, we've done an excellent job of doing things in the lab. We're pretty good at making scientific findings. We haven't done a very good job of communicating that to the public. And so we should value the people who are willing to work on that at least as much as we value the people who are working in the lab. But a lot of times when, for example, people get PhDs and go into what we think of as what we sometimes pejoratively call the alternative careers, some members of the scientific community look down on that. And the truth is, the alternative careers are the careers. I mean, it's being a PI in academia is probably the alternative career based on the number of people who actually do it. So I think, what we can do, what science can do is strongly promote a holistic idea of what the scientific enterprise needs to carry out. And that certainly includes science communication in addition to research.
Yes. Thank you, Holden, for that introduction. A recent study highlighted in your April 12th edition in Science supports the notion that public trust in science goes up if people perceive that scientists are open to changing their views when new data becomes available. This view is juxtaposed against the fact that many of us just want an answer to our most important questions that we can believe. How can the scientific community address this quandary?
Yeah, it's really tough because in addition to us just wanting the answer, we also like to be the ones who have the answer. So when we're asked, sometimes we get so excited about explaining what we know that we forget to say, well, but this could change if we do another experiment. And the reporters don't really like to include that, so they don't really help us with this because it doesn't sound as punchy in the newspapers. And if we're on TV, the follow-up question is always going to be something like, "Are you sure about this?" And none of us like to look indecisive, but we can't give into that. We paid an enormous price for that during the pandemic. Every time we had to revise our ways of thinking based on new evidence. And I think it's quite encouraging that the public surveys suggest that the public wants us to acknowledge that. I would worry more that they would say, oh, well, I want a science that has a definitive answer. But they're not telling us that. They're saying that they would trust us more if we would be better at reminding them that things could change if we do something new. The person who had my job at Nature for a long time was a legendary guy named John Maddox. And somebody asked him one time, how many papers in Nature are wrong? And he said, all of them, because some of them are wrong in the sense that there's something wrong with the data or something like that. But all of them are going to be replaced by new research in the future. And that's something that we just have to do the hard work of getting across. And I believe where we need to start is with our students, because we don't spend enough time teaching undergraduates and graduate students this kind of thing about the history and philosophy of science.
Yeah. I always find it very amusing to think back to people, what they were doing 100 years ago, and realize, oh my gosh, they missed so much of this. And then to think 100 years from now, they're going to be looking back at us and say, they were so foolish. Those people didn't know what they were talking about.
It's
And
true.
it's inevitable, and it's all right.
That's what makes it fun. I mean, that's the reason we're all doing this. If we all thought that we were just going to continue to reaffirm what we already knew, nobody would want to do any research.
Yeah. I find one of the most exciting things is when something I thought I knew has new data and I have to completely rethink the way I thought before. I just find that a joy.
Of course, but I think the worry is that when we do that, the people who want to undermine trust in science seize on it as a way of saying that we don't know what we're doing. And the only way to inoculate against that is for us to say it first, for us
Yeah.
to be the ones to say, yeah, we might have to change this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Holden, Albert Einstein, who was always good for a good quote, once said, if you can't explain what you're doing to a 9-year-old, then either you still don't understand it very well, or it's not all that worthwhile in the first place. We scientists are not taught how to communicate science to non-scientists. Some of us can barely communicate adequately what we're doing to other scientists. And in fact, Holden, you recently interviewed Adam Savage of Mythbusters on the Science Magazine podcast about this topic as well. What can be done for scientists to become more effective communicators? How can scientists better use new communication channels and partner with folks who are expert in the desired communication approaches?
Yeah, well, I think there's two avenues. One is that there are some scientists who are well suited and have an interest in doing this themselves, and they should have the opportunity to learn how to do it, and they should have encouragement from the scientific community that they're not wasting their time that could be spent in the lab by wanting to be outstanding science communicators.
Yeah.
And I think once you get over that point, there are plenty of good things like what Alan Alda has developed, or lots of other programs similar to that, where you can learn how to figure out whether somebody is understanding what you're telling them, and how to remind yourself that not everybody thinks about these things the same way you do, and a lot of the important things that you have to be able to do that. But I think the other important channel is to partner with people who are good at it, who may not either are scientists, but maybe not people who make research their primary activity, and also just people in the public who are enthusiasts who are really good communicators. And I think that that partnership has not been as strong as it could be. So one person that's getting a lot of attention now, and I think she's doing an absolutely terrific job, is someone named Katharine Hayhoe, who talks about climate change. And she is an evangelical Christian herself, and she's a very intuitive communicator who's great on camera, and is a very compelling writer, and she's everywhere doing this. There aren't very many Katharine Hayhoes who are in the lab working. So of course we want to try to make a few of them into people like her if we can, but it might be more effective for us to find more Katharine Hayhoes who can do the communicating in partnership with us. But all of that goes back to the value that the scientific community puts on this, because as long as the scientific communicators are treated as less important than the researchers, we're going to continue to have this problem. And I think a lot of the people who are enforcing that aren't aware of their own shortcomings when it comes to trying to do this. Like I always tell people, look, I write for other scientists. So if you want somebody to go out into the public and explain some complicated thing, I'm probably not the right person to do it. I spend all my time trying to get in the head of other scientists and figuring out how to write for them. And I'm very your listeners can probably tell that my vocal tone doesn't vary that much, and that's because I'm on the autism spectrum. And there are more people on the autism spectrum in science than in a lot of other professions. Um, and that makes us really good at making connections between things and maintaining a lot of information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm the right person to go talk to your uncle about why climate change is real. But there are people who are good at that. And those are the people that we need to cultivate. And some of them will come from the scientific community and some of them won't.
Are there things that you think can be done to improve the situation that aren't being done specifically? Courses in school, or what can be done?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to for the scientists is to teach them more about how science works and less about all the formulas and didactic stuff that they can probably teach themselves. And that is a thing that happens in college departments that's extremely unfortunate. But if the chemists are all sitting around deciding what courses go in the chemistry degree, the organic chemists want these courses and the physical chemists want these and the inorganic chemists want these. By the time you hash all that out, there's not enough room left for stuff about how science actually works. And so things that we take for granted, like as we were just talking about, the fact that we change our views when new data come around, become things that we take for granted that we forget are really special to the way we do things. I mean, science would be boring if we didn't do that. And we need our scientists to be better aware of that so that they remember when they're talking to somebody that that person probably doesn't want to be dazzled with all the picky little things they know about their experiment or their thing that they devoted their life to. They want to know more about how and why we want to understand whatever it is that they're trying to explain.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, Holden. Over the past many years, physicians are increasingly judged on how well they interact with their patients, on patient satisfaction, on how well they're working within, let's say, the hospital community in which they're employed. Is there perhaps an option for a similar sort of approach, maybe rewarding scientists who are seeking tenure track, who are doing a great job with scientific communication, bonus points or brownie points for those efforts, not just on numbers of publications?
Yeah, well, that gets to this idea of a better appreciation for the holistic goals of the scientific enterprise rather than simply having goals that are accomplishment and research. And the institutions, for sure, are not doing a good job of making room for that. And I think the workforce is responding in a pretty clear manner. You know, the number of people seeking postdocs is going down significantly in a worrisome way. And the number of people who are taking faculty roles that aren't necessarily the typical tenure track, get grants, publish papers, get tenure kinds of roles, that's telling you that people are voting with their feet about this. And so the universities really need to modernize the way they go about evaluating success and include in that success great teaching, great science diplomacy, great science policy work, great science communication. And boy, I wish I could be more upbeat about their ability to do that, but they're so busy trying to do so many different things. And research is such an easy thing to quantify that it's hard to get them off of just counting things. And that counting in research is a big barrier to the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Holden. That certainly is good food for thought. Earlier in this interview, you referenced some of the misunderstandings that may have been perpetuated during the pandemic, especially around the communication of science. What have been some of the recent major failures in the communication of science to the public, and how might they have gone differently?
Well, I just lived through one of the big ones, which was around COVID origins, because a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to testify before the committee investigating the origin of the coronavirus. And, I spent 2 weeks studying the origins of COVID much more carefully than I had in the past. And I have to say, and I think I said this in the hearing, I regret not doing it before that, because, some pretty famous papers came around. One's in Nature Medicine called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, and there's also a letter in The Lancet that came early in the pandemic. And both of them attempted to slam the door shut on the idea that COVID could have come from a research accident. And I still think it's very unlikely that COVID came from a research accident for a simple reason, which also has to do with the philosophy of science, namely Occam's razor. All of the other coronaviruses came from an animal. So in my view, until you've disproved that, you haven't ruled out the simplest possible explanation. And the research accident is a very convoluted pathway to get there. But we don't have any evidence to disprove the research origin. And we've never found, and we probably won't, the animal reservoir that would validate the market or the animal origin. And so given that, the fact that we jumped too fast onto, not considering the lab origin has made us look a little dismissive of people's concerns. And we would have been a lot better off if we had been saying at the beginning, and fortunately for me, these two papers weren't in Science. So that's one of the reasons why I agreed to go testify. I didn't have that much to tell those guys.
We should have been clearer early on that we don't know which
Right.
origin is
Right.
correct.
We should have been clearer earlier on that while we had good reasons for believing that the most likely explanation was an animal, that we didn't have firm proof of it, and we didn't have firm proof that ruled out the lab origin, because now we have to backtrack to that. And as we do that, we're making it look like we were disingenuous to begin with. And I don't think we were disingenuous. I think that the people who wrote those papers thought something logical. They wrote down the reasons for it. And they were, like all scientists, very excited about their findings and probably proclaimed them too enthusiastically. And just as we were saying before, forgot to throw in, oh, but this could change if we get something else. And that's a great illustration of the principle we were talking about before. I think, obviously there are several others of these. I know Dr. Fauci will regret the rest of his life that he said you didn't need to wear a mask and then had to change his mind. To most scientists, it made perfect sense that he went with what he knew, and then we learned some other things, and he had to change his stance. And I know a lot about that because we published the letter making the case for why COVID was airborne. And when we published that letter, we sent it to Dr. Fauci, and that's when he changed his stance. So for a scientist, this is a normal thing. But in the political world, it's just been just brutal for him, doing something that most scientists just think is our normal course of doing stuff. And, there were some others. I mean, everybody can look back and say, we probably we could have loosened some of the restrictions sooner. But it's easy to say that in retrospect, right? And so, but we forgot another thing, which is, as science was passionately saying, we have to keep the restrictions in place. We forgot to say, but a year from now, we may look back and see this was overly cautious, but we're trying to protect people's lives. And so we're going with the most cautious possible advice. When Joe Biden was elected, which I was very excited about, he had a victory celebration, and there was a big thing behind him that said, the people have chosen science. And a bunch of us who think and talk about this all the time were really worried when we saw that, because we knew there would come a time, even on the pandemic, where he would weigh something else more than he weighs science. And of course, that came when they decided to loosen the restrictions, right? I mean, if you go solely based on the science, COVID is a deadly virus. So why wouldn't you keep the restrictions in for a long time? Well, you wouldn't, because you want to reopen the economy and get people back in school and give people hope that their world is going to come back. And we elected them to balance all those things. And so when they put up something that implied that they were going to put science first in every decision they made, that was a harbinger of a bad road. And so what happened was, instead of saying the full story when they changed the restrictions, which would have been COVID is still a deadly virus, but we've decided based on everything that it makes sense to loosen these restrictions, they said, we're loosening the restrictions because there's not as much danger now. Well, a bunch of scientists really didn't like that, because the danger hadn't really changed. It was the balance of the danger with all of these other things. You know, Winston Churchill said, science should be on tap, but not on top. And we elect whoever we elect to take science and the economy and education and foreign policy and balance all of those things and figure out the right thing to do. And if we don't like the way they do it, we can try to elect somebody else. Most scientists want them to put science at the top all the time. Of course we would. Most foreign policy hawks want them to put foreign policy at the top. We don't elect them to do that. We elect them to balance all of those things. And so I think, these are hard lessons that we all need to learn.
That was such a wonderful response.
One thing I was thinking about is, as you were talking a little while ago, it seemed to me a lot of the problems that we have in making poor decisions scientifically has to do with confirmation bias. The fact that, we see the things that align with the way we're thinking, and we go down that way instead of asking our questions, what are the things that don't align? As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Darwin actually had a separate journal that he kept where he wrote all the things that didn't agree with his notions of evolution. He kept trying to figure out how I can deal with that.
Yeah, and of course, trying to rule things out is the basis of how science works. And again, it's something else we take for granted, that we're doing that, and we forget to articulate that. But the thing about confirmation bias and motivated reasoning is everybody has it, everyone. And so what worries me is not so much the fact that we have confirmation bias, because we're all human.
Yeah.
And it doesn't worry me that that'll give us the wrong answer in the long run, because the way science works, eventually people do more experiments and they argue and do all the things that they do, and we change things and get to the right answer. But what I really sort of cringe at is when one set of humans is saying that the other side has confirmation bias and not acknowledging it in themselves. Right. And there's a lot of that goes on. Oh, well, you just believe that the COVID came from the market because that's the liberal position. Well, wait a minute. Are you saying that your belief in the lab leak isn't partly motivated by your own politics? You're saying somehow you're the magically objective one? Well, no. The only honest way to describe that is that both groups are motivated by their politics and by their other human traits. And it's only through the messy, beautiful process of human beings duking it out over their ideas that we get to the truth. And the great thing is that as long as science with a small s and science with a big S value discoveries that change the way we think, then we don't have to worry that our confirmation bias will overcome the truth in the long run, because scientific ambition is stronger than confirmation bias. And the way to achieve notoriety as a scientist is to change the way that people think about science. And that will always get us the right answer in the long run.
Yeah, you're really describing here a cornerstone of social media in many ways.
I'm just thinking, though, that if you're a good scientist, you're thinking about the things that don't fit with your current beliefs. And if you're not actively doing that, you won't get to the better answer with time.
Right. I mean, that came up in the lab leak thing because there's some stuff in the emails where one of them said, yeah, we have to do everything we can to disprove the lab leak. These are the people who are writing the proximal origin paper. Well, of course they had to do that. That's what they were also doing everything they could to disprove the market origin if they were thinking like scientists. But we have done such a lousy job of explaining to the public that that's how we do it, that it makes our confirmation bias seem much more apparent than it really is.
Yeah. So the scientific community has occasionally been blessed with truly outstanding communicators. Some of my favorites are Carl Sagan, Richard Attenborough, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Feynman. They come to my mind. Who else do you think is doing this particularly well today? And how do these people learn those skills?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I think Catherine Hayhoe would be the person that a lot of people would put out there as the kind of the new generation of great science communicators. And I think she's doing a phenomenal job. I think all the people, well, certainly with Dick Feynman, I think he was such a great teacher. But he took seriously, now it's Caltech and you have to do everything well there. But
Right.
he took seriously going into his first year Caltech physics lecture and doing an amazing job. And the fact that he could do that, I think, and took it seriously is what bled into his ability to do that with lots of people. So I think for some people, being a great classroom teacher is a great avenue. And certainly for me, that was something that I was very focused on. And again, it's something that we don't put enough value on in the academy. If you're a great teacher, it's kind of an add-on. It's not something that stands on its own as a important academic accomplishment. And I think so. In addition to Catherine, I would say Neil deGrasse Tyson is certainly still out there doing this sort of thing. I do have to say for him and Carl, it is easier with astronomy. I mean, the pictures are better. Lots of people are interested in space. I had a gig one time for 4 years running a planetarium, and it's hard to compete with the if you're somebody who studies molecules, it's very hard to compete with the experience of putting somebody under a dome and turning all the lights off and putting the sky up above them. Like, no molecule is going to achieve that emotional force. But those, Carl Sagan certainly did a great job with that, and Neil deGrasse Tyson does a good job now. I think some of the people who are doing this well, I mean, certainly in the pandemic, despite the hiccup he had over masks, Tony Fauci did an amazing job as a communicator. And there's this subset of people who think that there was something insidious to what he was doing, but the truth is, every time he was on TV, he had people spellbound, and they were paying great attention to him. And he became the most famous scientist in the world. There's this parlor game that science policy people have, which is, if you went into a room of 500 citizens, how many of them could name a living scientist? And the answer to that used to be something very close to zero. And that experiment was tried many times and produced that result. But now, most people could name Tony Fauci as a scientist. And that's a really good thing, that we have somebody like that who is that well known, and we need more.
Yeah. So how do you think those people learn those capabilities?
Well, like I said, I think some of them learn it by being great classroom teachers. Some of them probably learned it through something in their childhood. Some of them, Francis Collins, I don't know if it's a natural gift for him or how he got it, but I think he perfected it in the halls of Congress. When I was a chancellor, I would go with Francis to call on members of the North Carolina delegation because a lot of them required an important person from North Carolina to be there. I would just come and say, hi, thanks for taking our meeting. Here's the director of the NIH who wants to tell you something. And Francis is masterful in those situations. And then I think some of the people who aren't scientists, I think Adam Savage for example, is really, really good. And I got a great opportunity to talk to him. And I think if you look at Mythbusters and what they achieved the ability to do sort of if-then thinking and get people to test things and rule them out and understand how that's done. Now, they did it sometimes with very simplistic things, but the scientific process was something that they did. And I think Adam continues to do that. And if you talk to him, or if you watch one of his videos or listen to the interview that I did with him, I mean, he's just so insanely excited and animated.
Yeah.
You know, again, somebody who has a brain like mine, I couldn't possibly achieve that. If I tried, somebody would wonder what was wrong with me. But Adam has the ability to just get so wound up. And when I asked him, you know, what was the key, he said, well, the key is the story. What story are we telling them? And, you know, if it's something that happened in a movie and they're testing whether it could happen or not, well, that story was built right into it. And, you know, blowing things up always, you know, he had to get in the bunker and wonder if he was going to get hurt. That built suspense. So I think with somebody like Adam, you know, it's about building suspense and building a story. But, you know, I asked him, I said, well, I think those of us who are really worried about misunderstandings about climate change would love it if you made a Mythbusters about climate change. And he said, I said, how come you never did that? And he said, because our whole shtick was building a model that people could see. And with climate change, you have all of these tiny things happening that add up to something big. And we could never figure out how to build a model of that. So I thought that was a very insightful thing. He said, you know, it was something they wanted to do. They talked about it all the time, and they never came up with anything that they could do.
That's very interesting. I recall him saying once that he has received many letters from people, emails, who became scientists because of Mythbusters, which is astonishing.
Oh, well, that includes my son, who's now on the faculty at Columbia. So in that interview, I thanked him for giving me a son who's a scientist like his old man.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's great. So Holden, these are fascinating discussions around Mythbusters, etc. How hard do you think it is to get people to change the way they think or their preconceived notions?
Yeah, well, I asked Adam Savage that question, and he told me a story about an episode they did called Airplane on a Conveyor Belt. All right, and the way this works is you put an airplane on a conveyor belt, and if the conveyor belt is going precisely the same speed as the airplane, such that the airplane is not moving forward in the X direction, you know, does it take off? Now, people who've taken freshman physics would know that the answer is yes. But there are many, many pilots on various pilot forums that he was looking at who didn't believe that was true. So they got a huge tarp and they attached it to a truck, and they got an ultralight airplane, and they put the ultralight airplane on the tarp, and they pulled the tarp at the same speed that they accelerated the plane to. And the person flying the plane was so ingrained in this idea that the plane had to be moving forward in the X direction in order to take off that he almost crashed because he wasn't expecting the plane to take off. And so the plane takes off, and you know, aerodynamics turns out to be validated yet again. But one thing he told me was afterwards, a lot of people who were ingrained in this just wrote to him and said, well, you must have done something wrong, because there's no way that can be correct, even though it's something that we would teach a high school physics student. And so this just shows how hard it is to dislodge these things when they get in people's heads.
That's very interesting. You know, as a result of the pandemic of the last 4 years, it's amazing how many people now know something about diagnostics they never knew before. You know, I can think my sister, who's an accountant, was asking me about PCR. That would never have happened before the pandemic. And we have tests that people can do at home, new ones coming along. What do you think that means for us?
Well, I think it's great anytime people have something in their own hands that is a product of science and is closer to uh, sort of how discovery happens. There's a lot of science in a cell phone, but most people who are using it aren't thinking about how their GPS works and how the electrons move around and all the things that are going on in there, even though those are things that scientists have spent centuries understanding. But something like a lateral flow COVID test is actually not that different from things that you would do in the laboratory if you were a scientist. And yeah, it's pretty foolproof. You don't have to worry too much about contamination and stuff like that when you're doing it. And you can even, a lot of times, not even follow the directions precisely. And it's such a strong signal that you still probably get a reliable result. But you're opening a little kit, you're taking a sample, you're putting it on a substrate where it flows. And that's pretty cool to think that many people are doing that. And they're also looking at their heart rate on their watch. And if they have sleep apnea, they can look on their phone when they wake up and see how many interruptions they had during the night. And they can measure all kinds of things that they then can do with their doctor on the screen instead of having to go to the doctor's office. And so I think all of this is, there's some scary things about it, like people concluding things about themselves that aren't really real. That worries me. There are probably a lot of cardiologists who get visits about things on Apple Watches that weren't real. But I guess that's better than not seeing someone who did have an abnormal EKG on their Apple Watch and decided to go in because of it. And so I think it's drawing people into science and medicine in a way that they haven't been drawn in before. And hopefully that'll give them more of an appreciation for how we get this stuff, because ultimately that's what we need.
Very interesting answer. It's like the easy bake oven approach.
There you go. Right.
To science. Well, this has been a terrific interview. Thank you so much, Holden, for your time and for the thought-provoking discussion around the importance of science communications.
Great to be on with you guys. Thanks for all you're doing.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah, I have fun in case you can't tell.
Good.
Great.
Halteres Presents is produced by Halteres Associates, a US-based bioscience consultancy that provides strategic and tactical services in the areas of diagnostics, medical devices, and life science research to clients of all sizes. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the episode are solely those of the individuals involved, and Halteres Associates is not responsible for any errors or omissions or for the results obtained from the use of this information. The information provided in this episode is for informational or educational purposes only and is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Halteres Associates would like to say thank you to this episode's guest or guests, and thank you for listening to this episode of Halteres Presents.